The ways that Americans practice religion is changing. In 2023, nearly 1 in 5 Americans had walked away from their childhood religious affiliation. That's according to the Public Religion Research Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Despite these changes, religion still plays a role in American life. The Pew Research Center says that while the number of Americans who identify as Christian is now down to 60%, nearly 90% of the members of Congress who were sworn in last year identify as Christian. Welcome to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we hear from people who spend a lot of their life talking about religion, both their own experiences and how it shapes society. Later in the show, we hear from Myokei Caine-Barrett Shonin. She's the first person of African American and Japanese descent and the only American woman to be fully ordained as a Buddhist priest within the worldwide Nichiren Order. But first, NPR national political correspondent Sarah McCammon. She grew up in Kansas City as an evangelical Christian. She and her family follow the religion's strict rules with regard not only to church and faith, but also to ideology. As she grew older, she began to question some of those teachings and ultimately left the Evangelical Church. Her new book is The Exvangelicals: Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. It tells her story and the story of so many others who felt disenchanted by the movement and walked away. Sarah, welcome to Disrupted.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into the heart of this book, because there's so much there, it's not just memoir and reflection. It's also really a view of what's happening now in the U.S., but over time. I want to make sure that our listeners are on the same page. When you use the term evangelical or the white evangelical church, let us know exactly what you're referencing there.
So evangelical is a term that scholars and pollsters debate and that journalists use and that gets thrown around fairly loosely. But I think usually what people are talking about, what I'm talking about, is theologically and often politically conservative Protestant Christians. So not Catholic, not mainline Protestant, but something like Southern Baptist or often a non-denominational church. There are a lot of different traditions that have informed and formed evangelicalism, but generally it's very focused on a personal relationship with Jesus, the idea that Jesus is the only way to heaven, often a very literal view of the Bible and a real emphasis on the Bible, the idea that you don't need a priest in between you and God. It's just direct connection with God. And there's this idea that it's very important to share one's faith with other people and sort of lead them to salvation. And often that also translates, particularly for white American evangelicals, into a political project that involves trying to promote a certain view of what the country should be like. Now, the reason I have white in the subtitle is because, when you look at Christians of color and white Christians who sometimes share very similar theological beliefs, they often vote very, very differently. And so I think it's important when we talk about religion, we can't talk about it without talking about race. Now, there will be some overlap with across the Christian churches. There are Black evangelicals, there are Latino evangelicals, and so forth. But I've chosen to sort of focus on the tradition that I come from, and one that happens to have outsized influence in the Republican Party and therefore in American politics.
I want to come back to this connection between religion and politics, because I think they are inseparable when we talk about this particular tradition and the way that it not only resonates with, but shapes people's everyday lives. And before we do that, I want to talk about your own experience. You grew up in Kansas City. And as I was reading the book and reading some of your experiences, I thought, wow, it sounds a lot like my upbringing growing up in the Bible Belt in Virginia, the home of Liberty University, the moral majority movement, so many overlaps. But for you, right, growing up as a white American in Kansas City offers a different layer and context to that. What was the role of religion, in particular, this connection to the white evangelical tradition? What was that experience for you growing up?
My whole world was was really the evangelical world. Everyone I knew, with a few exceptions, was a conservative Christian. Most of them were white. Now, my church, and I talk about this in the book, my church would talk about a desire to be more integrated and to build relationships with, for example, we had a sort of a sister church in downtown Kansas City that was predominantly Black, that we do projects with sometimes. So there was an awareness of that, but most of the people sitting, not in the pews, because this was one of those churches where everybody sat in folding chairs for a long time, but everybody sitting in the folding chairs and singing songs off the overhead projector most people were white. And it was the same thing in my Christian school, which was, again, there was some diversity, but very little. And I think that kind of speaks to a larger reality in much of the American church. It's something that, Dr. Martin Luther King famously talked about, the segregation of the Sunday morning hour. And there are a whole host of reasons for that. But for us, church, Christian school, Christian media, Christian books was our whole world. And we really saw anyone sort of outside of it as lost.
I'm listening to you, and our listeners can't see this, but I'm smiling as you're speaking, because that idea of, children's television was all Christian based for me growing up. And it wasn't really until I went away to college that I realized this wasn't the typical experience for other people, of having a very narrowly focused idea of what was acceptable within a community, and the ways in which outsiders, however they were defined, were really seen as a project for conversion, as opposed to how do we see where people are. Given that experience growing up in a particular community, was there a moment or an experience where you said, wait a minute, maybe this is not the way that things should be, or where you start to question, is this very defined view that I am living in the view that I want to have going forward? What was that for you?
There were so many moments along the way, and I try to kind of explain how painful and scary those moments could be, because when, as you described so well, when you're taught to see the world in that way, you're also taught that going beyond those boundaries is risky. It can be risky literally to your eternal soul, and also just to your well-being as a human. And look, I understand. I mean, I think many parents of all faiths who raise their child in a faith, they want to guide them and give them direction and structure. And there are many good, I believe, many good and wonderful things about that. But sometimes with those structures and those boundaries come exclusion. And so I think this is the tension that, that I've had to navigate, that many people I interview in the book have had to navigate, is where are those boundaries? Who's included? Who's not? And for me, one person who was very much not included was my grandfather. And he's a key character in the book because his existence involved coming out as gay late in life after my grandmother passed away. And he was a wonderful person, a very accomplished person, a kind person, but he didn't believe what we believed. And he was gay, which ran directly contradictory into what my parents believed and were hearing about in, the 80s and 90s, being involved in the Christian right. And it forced me to think about the fact that there were people who were different. And it wasn't just an abstract or a hypothetical. It was my own grandfather, who I didn't know that well. I wasn't allowed to spend a lot of time with, in part because of his sexuality, but who I loved and admired. And, that story is kind of a through line through the whole book, at how I grappled with that. And then with other people that I met along the way who sort of embodied the difference that you talk about.
Let's talk about that, because you talk extensively with other people from various backgrounds, various experiences, who have all chosen to leave the religion. And, of course, the title of the book, The Exvangelicals. For you personally, what does it mean to leave the religion, and how did that fit with what you heard from others? Because I think people often think, if you leave religion, does it mean that you leave faith, or you leave belief, or do you leave the organized, very limiting structure? What does that mean for you and for others?
It means a lot of different things for different people. And we're getting more and more data about looking at people who disaffiliate from religion or don't identify with a religion. And what it's found is that a lot of people, disaffiliation, lack of religious identity it's on the increase among younger generations, first of all. And a lot of people still express an interest in spirituality, even a belief in God, but not a desire to affiliate with organized religion. So for some of the people I talk to, that means completely moving away from church. Church is just too traumatic of a space for them. It's tied to all kinds of pain and confusion and often judgment, as they go through this process of going, I don't really agree with you on gay marriage or whatever it may be. Sometimes there's judgment and censure from people in the church or the family about that. Others, have moved into maybe more progressive Christian spaces or other types of church traditions. And other people, just talk about kind of looking for community and other things that have nothing to do with religion at all. For me, it's been some combination. It's been, when I heard the word exvangelical, and I first heard this word, I should say, while I was reporting on the 2016 campaign and talking to evangelicals who were struggling with the rise of Trump and the alignment with their movement, I heard that word and I felt like it said so much without really, it was this kind of container for a lot of different feelings, because it basically said, I've come from this community, it shaped me, but it's not who I am today. And for whatever reason, it's not the label that I want. When you come from a community where identity is wrapped up in belief, if those beliefs shift, sometimes that can feel like a real attack or a real rupture. And I never wanted it to be, but I also felt like I had to be honest about what I felt and didn't feel and what I thought. And so I tried a lot of different churches, tried to find one that felt right for me, coming from evangelicalism, which is really not ritualistic, not liturgical. If those things didn't always feel like they were working for me the way I thought they were supposed to, being able to go into a church that had rituals and where you could sort of do things and move your body and move with other people and recite things, for me, that was very helpful, because it was almost like a practice, like a way to engage spiritually with the Christian tradition. And it was less about what I was thinking or feeling at that second and more about what I was doing and participating, in with a community.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, faith is so deeply personal. It is so much about our individual connection, our individual ideas of what matters, right? Is it that I have a very defined view that I impose on others? Or is it that I believe that I can be connected to something greater than myself, which then allows me to appreciate that and see that divinity in other people? And at the same time, Sarah, as I'm sure you know, in writing about and talking about your experience, it forces others to reckon with theirs. How has that been for you in terms of the convos that you have with your family or with others? Because you are talking about what it meant for you. It also holds up a mirror in some ways I imagine that maybe they don't want to address or are not ready to address. What's that meant for you?
I had conversations before I published the book with multiple family members and wanted to make sure that they all understood what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I took their feedback into account, and I didn't want anyone to be blindsided. And, what I've made clear is that I needed to talk about my family, and I've tried to limit it to the things I felt were salient and important in order to tell my story. Because as you say, it's my experience, and the experiences of others that I interviewed. In terms of the responses I've gotten, I've actually been really surprised how few angry responses I've gotten to the book. I sometimes begin by telling people this book is not anti-religion at all. It's really about, as you say, and I so appreciate the way that you describe that. It's about my specific experience and other people's specific experiences. There's no desire to tell anybody what their relationship to faith should be, or their relationship to politics, for that matter. It's simply, I'm a journalist. I like to write about what I see and hear, and I've tried to use that approach, even though obviously this is part memoir, so I'm not a neutral party in this one, but I've tried to use sort of those tools as a journalist to tell the story in that way. Overwhelmingly, the responses have been so positive. I've heard from a lot of people, actually from a variety of faith traditions, who've said, I really resonate with this. I really relate to this struggle of trying to process and make sense of what I've been told and what my community believes versus who I am. Because it can feel like a very lonely process until you realize that so many people go through it in one way or another. And I've also heard from people who have no relationship to evangelicalism at all, who've said, the way you sort of paint a picture of this world that you grew up in, and the way that many white evangelicals think, and the way that those beliefs intersect with politics, has really helped me to understand more about the moment we're in culturally and politically. And so I really appreciated those responses.
That was NPR national political correspondent Sarah McCammon. Her new book is called The Exvangelicals: Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Coming up, Sarah talks about the connection between white evangelicals and politics. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about religion and its influence on American society. Later, we hear from Myokei Caine-Barrett Shonin. She's the first person of African American and Japanese descent, and the only American woman to be fully ordained as a Buddhist priest within the worldwide Nichiren Order. But now we turn back to our conversation with Sarah McCammon, NPR national political correspondent and author of the new book, The Exvangelicals: Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. In 2016, Sarah was assigned by NPR to cover the presidential campaign of then candidate Donald Trump. I asked Sarah what she saw while covering the rallies that connected white evangelicalism, the religion that Sarah grew up with, to right-wing politics.
I think when I'm often asked, did you see the Trump thing coming, or were you surprised that evangelicals supported him? And I have to say yes and no. I had, as I mentioned, had quite a bit of distance from my evangelical background by the time I was assigned to cover the 2016 campaign. And I, rather unexpectedly found myself covering the same movement that I'd grown up in. I was first assigned to the Republican primary, and that meant covering a whole bunch of different people. That was, as I'm sure you remember, a very big primary field in 2016. And then it was Trump. It was all about Trump, and it became all about, what the white evangelical base was going to do and how they were going to respond. And I was fascinated with it. I was curious. I remembered really well how the evangelicals I grew up around had responded in the 90s to Bill Clinton's moral failings, and the anger that was directed at him, and the calls by prominent evangelical leaders for an emphasis on character and values. The evangelical vote, the Christian right, has been built up over many decades of work by people like Jerry Falwell, James Dobson, and many others who've built the groups like the Moral Majority and Focus on the Family and others. And really, we saw that vote mobilized powerfully for Donald Trump in 2016. And I think, what white evangelicals heard and hear still when Trump speaks to them is this idea of America in decline. And they believe it's in decline because it's moved away from Christianity. In many ways, the fact that Trump has risen to where he's risen as a movement leader at the same moment that white Christianity is a shrinking part of the population, is really at its lowest ebb ever. It's not an accident. So the evangelical movement has been building as it had an awareness of that shrinking cultural power. And Trump promised to make America great again and to bring back this declining country. And those words meant something to evangelicals. It echoed what they've been hearing for a long time. And I hear that language from him quite a bit today in the 2024 campaign. And if anything, I think it's only escalated.
And I think about the outsized impact of what you said is a declining group in terms of size and connection. There are generational aspects to that. There are geographical implications, racial, as the country is diversifying. How do you claim a base and then continue that impact? And at the same time, I'm thinking, Sarah, we are in the 2024 election cycle. we are thinking about the impact of the pandemic on people's sense of religion and connection and all of those ways. So the landscape is somewhat different from 2020. But I think no less important to think about how mobilizing this base could have an impact, not just in the presidential election, but some of these key decisions that are happening at the local and state level, whether it's bans on books and DEI or policy changes around reproductive rights and access. Based on your research, your experience, your knowledge, what should we be paying attention to in 2024 as we think about this base of white evangelical voters and how they might maneuver?
I'm curious at what point there's sort of a tip, because the best numbers I've seen, I think, suggest that white evangelicals are now about 14% of the country, up, down from a peak in my youth of close to a quarter of the country. That's a big drop in a key, reliable voting bloc for Republicans. And yet, because of all of that work over many decades to put conservative Supreme Court justices on the Supreme Court, to redraw congressional and state legislative boundaries, Republicans can exert a lot of control, particularly over state legislatures. For 2024, I think certainly the abortion issue is one to keep watching. There's so many interesting things happening around that. I think now that we are more than a year and a half post the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, that's opened up a whole variety of new questions about just how far some of these restrictions should go. And I think that's exposing rifts in the anti-abortion movement. We've seen the controversy around fertility treatments, IVF in Alabama, and there's overwhelming support among white evangelicals for IVF, even though there's strong opposition to abortion. And that's sort of forced these conversations about some of the underlying philosophy, behind ideas like life begins at conception. Well, what does that really mean? And what does that mean for policy? If that's something that you espouse, as many anti-abortion advocates do, what does that mean for something like IVF? And so I think those controversies will continue to be really fascinating, those policy debates. The other thing, and this is a longer term question, but I'm curious what happens to particularly the Latino evangelical vote. If there's any growth in evangelicalism, it's in the Latino church, not in the white church. And Latino voters are a fascinating demographic. They are a big, growing demographic. They are not at all monolithic. And there is a lot of interplay between white and Latino evangelicalism, because Republicans have made a lot of efforts to try to appeal to voters of color. There's some evidence that those have worked to some extent, but how much and for how long, I don't know.
As you're talking, I was thinking about gender and how gender is going to play into some of this, whether we're talking about Latino evangelicals or, people overall who espouse these very conservative views around politics, but also the role of women and what that should be. My last question to you, we've seen this growing number of people who don't identify with any particular religious tradition, or who say that, yes, they're spiritual, but no, they don't identify. I'm curious, given your work on, politics and religion and how all of these are playing out, I'm curious what you think the future might be for when we think about the connection between religion and politics. Do you think that people will say, yes, I need a separation, not because I don't believe, but because you are dictating things? Or do you think this will continue to be such an important part of American politics?
I think that's a great question. I would need to see more research on this, but I'm curious how much of the disaffiliation it overlaps with the increasing politicization of religion. I mean, I don't want to blame it all on that, but I think sometimes when I talk to younger people, especially, I think there's a sense of burnout. And this is something I've even heard from evangelical sources, like, younger Christian college kids just don't want to talk about politics because they're tired of it. Certainly some of them do. And that's anecdotal, but I am curious how much of a sense of that, how much of that sea change is partly being fueled by a sense that the rhetoric has just become so vitriolic, and these two things have become too intertwined. I think also when we look at data about religious nuns, NES, people who don't identify with a religion, many of them are not particularly politically active. And so to me, they tend to lean left toward Democrats, but they're not as politically engaged, not nearly as conservative white evangelicals. And so I think that presents a challenge for certainly for Democratic activists. Like there's this huge group of people that is, and it appears to be growing, that is probably sympathetic to the Democratic political goals, but can they be harnessed in the same way? I don't, that doesn't appear to be the case. And there have been a lot of efforts to sort of form a religious left movement to galvanize liberal Christian voters around progressive issues. And some of those I think have had some impact. But again, it doesn't seem to have the force or the unity of the Christian right. Now, I'm talking primarily about the white religious left, because of course there's a long tradition of successful advocacy for civil rights by the Black church. But I wonder if some of those movements will do a better job of working together, or if someone will figure out how to sort of harness this kind of amorphous group of people who just aren't part of anything. I think it's so much harder to unite around I'm not anything than I am this. And so that seems to be the challenge, but it is a really fascinating shift.
Yeah, I agree with you. Seeing how that force, that unity, and that funding may have an impact on how people are organizing and delivering will be critical. Sarah McCammon is a national political correspondent for NPR. She's author of the new book, The Exvangelicals: Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kalila.
Gen Z is identified as people who were born between 1997 and 2012. About 40% of people in that generation identify as spiritual, but not religious. That's according to a market research study. So we reached out to 3 Gen Z-ers and asked them about their relationship with religion and spirituality.
My name is Sophia Pedro. I am from Western Massachusetts, and I have followed the Catholic religion. I have been Catholic my whole life. I was baptized Catholic when I was just a baby. Both of my parents were Catholic. We grew up going to church, and then there was a period of time where we kind of stopped going to church for a little bit. I don't really know what kind of caused that. I think we kind of just got caught up in our lives, and we always still believed in the religion and followed the principles of it without kind of going to church as much. I'm really happy that we started going again, though. I think as a family, we've kind of strengthened our religion. The quality of my life feels like it has increased now that we go to church again. We just feel better. Believing in God, believing that there's a higher power, it's so comforting. I pray almost every night, and the typical asking God for something, but also thanking Him for all the blessings that He's given you. It's just such a beautiful feeling. I wouldn't say I'm spiritual. If you had asked me that, I would respond yes, I believe in God. But I don't know if there's much of a distinction, but my go-to is to say that I'm religious rather than spiritual.
My name is Maro. I'm originally from Pakistan. I've been in New York City for the last 7 years of my life. And growing up, I was affiliated with Islam, and that's the religion I currently follow as well. As a practicing Muslim, religion decides every aspect of my life. So whatever job we do, however we decide to celebrate, how we interact with people, how we celebrate with friends, everything is decided by religion itself. The term spiritual has gained fame now. Everybody is spiritual, even if they don't follow a specific religion. I wouldn't call myself spiritual, so I don't know what it means for me to be spiritual. For me, it's everything is about following the book and the last prophet. So that's how I see things. Religion is a way of life, and once you just like follow it, some people think that, oh my God, your life is so hard, you do this and you do that, but like part of like having a religious and belief system is like believing in it and following through. So whatever you believe in, go through with it.
My name is Riya Sood. I am from India. And when I was born, I was affiliated to Hindu religion. So when I moved to boarding school, I was around people of different religions, different castes. Even like in India, I had people from US residing there. So slowly and steadily, I began realizing that religious does play a role, but in schools, we were taught one thing: God is one. I started realizing if God is one, then why are religions different? When I started growing up, I would ask my dad, like, there are certain days you visit the Gurdwara and there are certain days you visit a temple. Why? So he taught me one thing: you do not have to do it for the sake of people. This is where it belongs. You just have to have faith. You do not have to show it to anybody. In order to live this materialistic world, all you have to have is a little faith in yourself, like a little power. That's when I believe that it all comes down to, for me, being spiritual more than being a religious person. I believe for me, being spiritual means connecting with something that is greater than ourselves, like something that is greater than our own within selves. And in order to perceive that, for me, it is more like meditating or doing some self-practicing activities which keep me at peace. If you're spiritual, do not disrespect the fact that they believe in something called God. But if you are religious, do not bring religion, do not bring the name of God in order to do the practices that are harmful. I respect everything, but in the name of God, do not do such things that could harm somebody.
That was Sophia Pedro, Maruk, and Ria Sood. Thank you for sharing your stories and your experiences with us. Coming up, we learn about the Nichiren Order of Buddhism with Myokei Caine-Barrett, Shonin. Disrupted will return in just a moment. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about religion and its influence in American society. About 500 million people across the globe follow Buddhism, and in the United States, that number is between 3 and 4 million. Women have been included in Buddhism since its earliest years, some 2,500 years ago. Today, however, some countries' Buddhist practices are shaped by gender inequities. Women can be ordained as the equivalent of monks in China, South Korea, and Japan, but not in Tibet or Laos. In 2007, one gender barrier was broken right here in the United States. After years of following the path of Shonin, or priesthood, Myokei Caine-Barrett became the first person of African American and Japanese descent and the only American woman to be fully ordained as a Buddhist priest within the worldwide Nichiren Order. She's resident priest of Myokei-ji Temple in Houston and joins us now. Myokei, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you.
I am so excited to talk to you because as we have read about your experience, learned about the amazing work that you're doing, there's so many layers there that I really think speak to our broader question about the role of spirituality and where we are right now. You have made history as the first person of African American and Japanese descent and the only Western woman to be fully ordained as a Buddhist priest. You're also resident priest in Houston. I have to ask this basic question, which is, share with us your journey to becoming a Buddhist priest, because all the things I just mentioned are quite rare and really amazing. Right. What is your journey there?
I'm the child of a war bride, World War II bride from Japan. And the community that was established around that fact that these were all Japanese war brides who had children. And so we hung out together. Primarily, these were women who were married to African Americans who were enlisted personnel. And so they all had to deal with similar issues. And as a part of dealing with that was the development of their faith in Buddhism. And they taught it to the kids. And my mother was not really interested in the religious aspect, but she had friends who were. So I was invited in to go to Amarillo because she did not want to go, but allowed me to go with the warning that I was not to join anything. And naturally, when you're a preteen or just there, that when you hear that, it's like, oh, really? Watch me. And so I did join and started to practice. But it was more just being part of that community because I had been searching for a while and didn't hear the answers that I needed from the different churches I went to. And in the military, you don't go to like an Episcopal church or Lutheran. You go to a Protestant church under which there are many different branches. So Buddhism answered my questions at the time. And it wasn't really until I went to college that I started to deepen my practice because I was very naive and away from home by myself for the first time. So I needed an anchor for that experience.
Let's talk about your practice, because I think for people of faith, for people who are aligned with spirit, it is often a way of addressing the physical challenges and the spiritual challenges that we encounter, and an opportunity to not only go within, but to connect as well and be able to resolve through that. Your particular practice of Nichiren form of Buddhism is distinct in some ways in terms of how the practice is carried out. Share with us some of those distinctions or those practices.
Well, we chant Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, which is the title of the teaching that we follow, the Buddhist teaching called the Lotus Sutra. And so what we're chanting is I respect or I devote myself to Myoho Renge Kyo, Myoho meaning wonderful Dharma, Renge, lotus flower, Kyo, the sutra. So I devote myself, respect the sutra of the lotus flower of the wonderful Dharma. We also chant the entire sutra itself, not all at one sitting. It's split up into 31 days so that you can chant a different part of it every day if you wish. But there is a standard practice. More Buddhists will chant than do silent meditation. It's just silent meditation has been made more popular, particularly in the West. But it is a practice that doesn't require understanding. It doesn't require faith initially. Once you get into it and you start to see the impact in your life, it requires that you continue to study, continue to just interact with the teachings to go deeper. It's a very, very deep teaching. And the more you study it, the more you understand its lifelong nature, that it's something that can be a guide for the rest of your life. And it's always new.
It's a beautiful thing, too, that you have this lifelong guide, because there's so many different stages throughout our lives in terms of where we are, what we feel we need, what we're seeking, or what we need to connect to and be grounded. And I'm curious because I've always thought of Buddhism as being a very inclusive tradition, of not having the same kind of constraints as some other traditions that allow people to explore where they are. And I want to raise this Global Buddhist Summit that was held last year. The title was Responses to Contemporary Challenges. And many people said one of the challenges of this global summit was the lack of women's representation. And as I said at the start of our conversation, you have made history in many different dimensions as a woman who is leading by example, but just by who you are. Do you see that as an irony or a contradiction? Or how are people sort of reasoning through, we are an inclusive tradition, and yet we still don't see women as much in these positions?
There's a lot of diversity in the entire Buddhist community due to the three branches, overall, the Theravadan, which is the ancestor or the historical, Mahayana, which opened the pathway to enlightenment for everyone, and Vajrayana, which is, we largely can refer to Tibetan type Buddhism. It includes the esoteric, the magic, but all of us have the magic. And in Theravadan, because it was in a culture where women were not valued so highly, and in the early stages of Buddhism, there were many rules for women and for men to try to keep peace within the Sangha. And over time, I think it became so implanted that people never considered what it was all about, these restrictions. And so today, in many places, it's still very, very difficult for women to be ordained, particularly in the Theravadan tradition. In Mahayana, like the Nichiren school in Japan, I would say roughly a third of the women, of the priests that are ordained are women. But they also are under typically what are known as the three obligations, which are to your father, your husband, and then to your son, that you have these duties. There are many cultural things that hamper the progress of women. But one of the things I would argue for in Japan is that the women there who are really working it are going to change it because they're finally coming into their own power.
I appreciate you helping us understand not just the context, but also the tremendous diversity that exists. You are resident priest in Houston, which has lots of different contextual challenges there. Talk to us about the community work that you're doing, because you are engaging in spaces with people who often get overlooked or marginalized within broader society, and bringing them in a way that I think affirms their humanity, but also affirms our connection. Talk to us about your work in Houston.
Well, primarily the work external to the community is in the prison system. And it's one we've been engaged in since 20 years. And we've made a lot of progress in terms of being able to hold some of the events that we've held, like day-long retreats, and bringing in foods, and really having periods of intensive practice. One of the first things I can tell you truthfully is when I started in the prison system that I had a list of the type of people I was not going to have to deal with, because it was like, okay, they're rapists and murderers and pedophiles. So hopefully I won't have to deal with those. And I had to deal with those. And it was fortunate that I did not know at first what they had done. So I was able to come to love them without that shadow of my prejudice. And I really learned, even if I can't understand why a particular crime happened, I could also understand that these were people who had not really been loved and cared for well when they were children. And they didn't know how to do that. And one of the things we were able to do is create community. There are three jewels or three treasures in Buddhism, and it's the Buddha, the Dharma, or the teaching, and the community, the Sangha. And the Sangha, and this is what I learned from the war brides, even though I didn't realize what I was learning from them, was that the community is a critical element in the practice of faith. You can have all these wonderful teachings and, great teachers, but if there's no community to support you, to uplift you, to carry you then it's not really happening. And we started using circle practice or council practice, if you will, and people were able to speak and share their truths without judgment, because what's said in the circle stays in the circle unless you have permission from the person to ask questions. And one of the guys told me that the greatest gift we gave them was the gift of Sangha, because it allowed them to really understand supporting each other. So they are able to stop the division. I mean, the community we have behind bars is unique because it's a mixed race community. We have Asians, Latins, and African Americans, and white folks, and they're all mixed together, practicing together. And recently we gained a couple of trans folks, trans women in a 100% male prison. And I was so proud of my community because they decided among themselves they would take care of these women who were just suddenly thrust into their midst. So they've done that absolutely well. And it's a beautiful relationship that I tend to think of my guys in prison as my sons.
I hate to end our conversation because I feel I could just listen to you so much. But I do want to end on this note. You have mentioned the Sangha, the community, the search, the longing, the needing of Sangha in these times. Right. At a time in the US where things seem so divided, so contentious, where people seem like they are searching for something and the inability to find that something is creating this division. What would you say to our listeners who are in search of community or purpose?
Find the place where you feel comfortable, where you are accepted, where you are loved without reservation, and lean into that and build those relationships with other folks, because we're all looking for a place of belonging, a place where we can be safe, where we can be cherished, where we can be expressing our true selves. So we don't have to hide. What would happen if you actually honestly said what you were feeling to someone and they heard you and they responded? And that's just the beginning, that you're building relationships. I think as a society in this country, we're not comfortable with deep relationships because we're always looking for, well, that person's different from me. But we are actually all the same. We all suffer the same. None of us escapes birth, aging, sickness, and death. None of us. So since we're all sharing those particular sufferings, we have to find a way to support each other through and to also expect and give that to ourselves and others at every opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us of that connection and the need to be honest with ourselves and with others. Myokei Caine-Barrett Shonin is resident priest of Myokei Temple in Houston. She's the first person of African American and Japanese descent and the only Western woman to be fully ordained as a Buddhist priest. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Wayne Edwards, Meg Dalton, and Katie Tolarski. Our interns are Scout Raymondo and Sajina Shrestha. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.